Thank you for having me this morning, Samantha and Renee and Raps. I'm happy to discuss strategies for pre-market approval success in today's session. Going on to the next slide, we introduced ourselves. I'll be presenting and Samantha will be our moderator. And I just want to go over a high-level outline of what we'll be talking about today. So product definition, what is device, what is indication, what is claims, testing expectations, early interactions with FDA. So what's the development of testing expectations and strategy process like? Managing change, what's in a pre-market submission or what's expected, or best practices in a pre-market submission, what to expect during the review process when FDA receives the submission, and in the long view, what happens afterwards or after approval. So in general, it's important to tell your story. The idea is that you're going in the impression that, or the lead reviewer or the review team has no knowledge of your device, its history, the testing to support it, the claims, indication, etc. So make sure to be as thorough as possible. And in preparation for that, there's various tools and resources that you can look at, whether through the FDA website or in public sites, which include eStar, which is a template for review, guidance documents, standards, approval clearance precedents for similar devices or in a similar category, and also communication methods that are there throughout, before, during, and after PMA review. So as I mentioned, though the review team will have clinical and technical expertise and background, it is important to develop the product description and all supportive information as if they have never seen a device before. So the product definition can include what is it, how is it made, the primary mechanism of action. And indications is what is the patient population the device is intended to treat? What disease is it intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent? As far as claims goes, marketing claims for FDA medical devices must be truthful, non-misleading, and supported by valid scientific evidence consistent with the device's intended use. All claims, both expressed and implied, need to be backed by data. In this process, it's important to talk with your marketing department and understand if you want to say it is better than any existing products out in the market, is it safer, or if you need a particular claim to support reimbursement. All of this in preparation for developing your submission and your regulatory pathway. Going in detail about indications for use, these are several things to consider. So what is the target patient population? Is it meant for pediatrics, adults, or both? The extent of disease state. Is it to treat something occasionally, periodically, or is it supposed to treat something permanent? How is it used? Is it meant to be surgically implanted or administered through a transcatheter approach? And what is the clinical benefit to the patient? Is it meant to reduce the disease state or eliminate the disease state, or maybe even diagnose the disease state? There's also a distinction between the diagnostic and tool. So diagnostic is a specific type of medical device that is meant to detect diseases or conditions or monitor health. Examples of that are X-ray machines, MRI scanners, blood glucose meters, and in vitro diagnostic test kits. Tool, on the other hand, aid in the development and validation of other medical devices. So those could include computational models or in vitro test systems, for example. So when you're...
Sorry to interrupt you, Jhumur. A quick question that came up on slide number 6. Looking at all these elements that make up the indications for use, how specific should the indications for use statement should be?
So it can be broad or specific. The important thing is whatever you end up trying to delineate in your indications for treatment as your patient population, your treatment modality, if is it meant to cure, treat, or diagnose, it is clearly backed by any valid clinical scientific data. So There are various strategies that you can utilize that FDA has available to help hone in on that if you have any questions about it. But that's a starting point that making sure that you have data to back the indication, whether it is broad or specific. There's no clear-cut rule for that.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Of course. As far as testing expectations, it is important to evaluate all possible risks throughout the product lifecycle, which involves design, manufacturing, and then during post-market use, and have a detailed risk mitigation plan. This includes risk analysis and validation and verification testing. It's also important to evaluate device robustness of safety and performance per proposed indications by bench, animal, and clinical testing that either resembles or most accurately resembles device use settings. The extent of testing, of course, is based on the risk classification and level and identified risks from the risk assessment. So the next step is confirming whether the PMA is the correct regulatory pathway for your device. There are other submission types too to consider, and it is partially determined by the device risk classification. So 510K mainly is used to demonstrate substantial equivalence. There's various types, so there's traditional, special, and abbreviated safety and performance. For traditional, it's mainly for new class 2 devices to demonstrate that a medical device is as safe and effective or substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device, also referred to as a predicate device. Just a refresh for all of you may have heard or are familiar with it, a legally marketed device is a device that has been classified from either prior to a pre-amendment device, which has been reclassified from class 3 to class 2 or 1, or a device which has been found substantially equivalent through the 510K process, or device that was granted marketing authorization via the de novo classification process that is not exempt from pre-market notification requirements. The other subtype of a 510K is a special. So in this particular case, it does not apply because it's usually modifications to an existing 510K device that could affect its safety and effectiveness. For abbreviated is for device that meets certain standards, such as voluntary consensus standards or special controls. The next type of submission is the de novo. So it provides a marketing pathway to classify novel medical devices, which general controls alone or general and special controls provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for the intended use, but for which there is no legally marketed predicate device. So this type of submission is a risk-based classification process for classification of the device into class 1 or 2. And usually this is prepared after receiving a high-level NSE determination in response to a 510K submission or upon the sponsor's determination that there's no legally marketed device upon which to base a determination of substantial equivalence.
Jhumur,
HDE.
While
Yes.
we are talking about the 510K, we have a question from the audience. For a 510K pathway, how much difference can be accepted in terms of indications for use?
So in comparison to the predicate device, I'm assuming, right?
I think so, yes.
So I believe that depends on the device technology and what exists currently. And then the risk classification based on your risk assessment. With all those factors combined, could it be determined, and also, prior precedent from discussing with your FDA reviewer who was involved in the previous 510Ks, if you have submitted 510Ks before. I think those are all various factors. There's no clear cut sort of, okay, if it has this component or this feature, therefore it's not eligible for 510K. I think this is something that has numerous factors involved. I don't know. I mean, this is the best I can answer for that.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Our typical answer is it depends usually.
Yeah,
so.
Of course. All right, I'll let you get on to the HDE section.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. So for HDEs, it's requires a humanitarian use device designation first. And that's usually requested through the FDA's Office of Orphan Products Development. And then the HD application is the second step in seeking marketing authorization of HUDs. So the distinction between that and a PMA is that we're looking at safety and probable benefit for less than 8,000 subjects per year. And it's usually for a niche patient population, for a very niche disease state. So it's very limited in terms of what it's providing for the patients, and it's mostly, it's not for profit. And then the next step is, or the next category of submission is the PMA, where you're evaluating the safety and effectiveness of Class 3 medical devices that support or sustain human life, are of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, or which present a potential unreasonable risk of illness or injury. So due to the level of risk associated with Class 3 devices, FDA has determined that general and special controls alone are insufficient to assure the safety and effectiveness of Class 3 devices. There are specific PMA controls involved in those types of submission, in addition to general and special controls. It is the most stringent type of device marketing application required by FDA, and the sponsor must receive FDA approval before marketing the device. Within the PMA submission category, there are 3 types. So there's the original, which is a complete review of everything, bench, animal, clinical, in the full 180-day time frame. Then there's the module, which is the modular PMA, which is more of a fragmented review based on different disciplinary areas while the clinical study is being developed and finalized. And then it gets converted to original PMA. And then there's the PMA supplement, which is for changes that happen for the particular device after the PMA is approved. So it's a lot to consider here, but just to ensure that the PMA is the right pathway, do look at all the different submission types before going that route.
Jhumur, there is a quick
Yes.
another question that came up on the PMA supplements. So we received a question asking whether the PMA supplements submitted while an original or modular PMA is under review.
Yeah, so typically the PMA supplements are tied to the original PMA that was approved. So any changes that happen after the PMA product is approved, whether it's in expanding the indication or a manufacturing process change or a design change, those are separate supplements, and there's different types of supplements that can be found in the modifications for PMA devices guidance document that are submitted to approve that particular change. So short answer is they are not submitted while the original PMA is under review. It's only after the original PMA has been approved, given full approval.
Perfect. And there's, I hope there are a couple of more questions on the same slide as you were presenting on. So when exactly the de novo procedure is used?
When exactly is it used? Usually it's for novel devices for which there's no established predicate. So usually for like Class 2 or 1 devices, and usually that process identifies what the classification strategy is, the classification should be for that device, and then thereon after it becomes can be used as a predicate for a 510(k) or just as a reference device for future submission.
Yeah, thank you. And there is another question on what are examples of PMA controls?
So there might be specific follow-up categories, like post-approval study follow-up categories for a device with a certain indication, specific testing requirements. So it has to have a certain clinical study with different specific endpoints, or there's specific animal testing that needs to be conducted that resemble the test, the actual use condition. Those are, yeah, specific things I can think of, but that varies based on the type of device and what intended use there is.
Yeah. Thank you. That I hope everything has been answered, so we can go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. So another aspect to consider as you develop your PMA, or if you've confirmed that PMA regulatory pathway is the right approach for your device, is to consider the Breakthrough Devices Program and Safer Technologies Program. It is for specific types of devices in terms of what they intend to treat, and there's a slight distinction between the two. So the main premise, though, of the program is to provide patients and healthcare providers with timely access to innovative products, and then expedite the development, assessment, and review of certain devices that meet the program eligibility criteria. So to highlight what breakthrough devices or designated devices is that it's for more effective treatment of the diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. And for the STEP program, it's for devices reasonably expected to significantly improve the safety of currently available treatments or diagnostics that target an underlying disease or condition associated with morbidities and mortalities less serious than those eligible for the Breakthrough Devices Program. The vehicle for these requests are Q submissions, but the specific criteria governing whether it's a breakthrough or STEP designation is granted are different, as I stated there, and also is listed in the guidance document and their website at the FDA. So if you have any specific questions about requesting these designations in a Q sub, you may contact the relevant team mailboxes that are listed there. They can help answer any specific questions or further questions you have about these programs and whether you should consider it for your device or not. So given that you've confirmed that PMA is the correct regulatory pathway to pursue for your device, you can explore other early interactions with FDA before submitting your IDE or PMA. So in general, just note that there are different types of Q subs, and they're all outlined in the guidance document link provided in this slide. And typically, before pre-market studies are conducted or a pre-market submission is sent for review, the type of Q sub to use is the pre-submission Q sub, where you provide, where you can utilize that program to consult with FDA on the proposed testing strategy, for example, any other general strategy you intend to use. And FDA is able to provide that formal written feedback for you to consider as you develop your submission. And it has no user fees, and it's a great opportunity for the potential review team on your future submission to become familiar with the device and functionality. And it can help when you do have the PMA submission in-house, there's a level of regulatory history in terms of the feedback and guidance that was provided to help expedite the review when it is in-house. So for the Q submission in general, best practice is to tell us about your device, your general strategy, and just to obtain our thoughts by asking specific questions. And then also potentially discuss complex preclinical testing like MR evaluation, drug testing, chronic performance. And then it's also, like I mentioned, asking questions about the test protocol before the actual testing. It's specifically very helpful for animal study work, for example, where it is critical to do it right the first time. And another important emphasis is that it's not a pre-review of the submission. We do not expect reviewers to review data and have them provide initial feedback on whether it meets, a certain standard or expectation or criteria that would typically have been allowed in a PMA submission. So please keep that in mind as you develop this. This is more of like a consulting, getting general feedback, helping with your strategy and formulating a general guideline or your submission approach. Another distinction to make is that there's a 513G, pathway, which is a request for classification determination. The purpose of this submission type is to obtain the FDA's views about the classification and the regulatory requirements that may be applicable to your particular device. Unlike Q-Sub, there is a user fee involved. So that's another program that you can utilize as you develop your PMA submission. And of course, before you officially submit your PMA submission, you're also developing a clinical trial, granted that your device is Class 3 or requires extensive clinical studies. And for that, you can also submit a pre-submission for an IDE. And all the previous points that I mentioned in the slide before apply for that as well. So you can formulate specific questions related to strategy, testing, models, indications, study design, sample size, and defining all the endpoints and check whether it is robust or not from a clinical and regulatory point of view.
Jhumur, we have a quick question from the audience. So is a Q-Sub mandatory for a PMA submission? Are there scenarios in which a Q-Sub is not recommended?
So Q-Sub is not necessarily mandatory, but it is highly advised. It helps facilitate early discussions about the product throughout the product development lifecycle. So, for example, if the company is involved in developing a prototype and they're at the early stages and they're trying to understand what kind of testing is expected or what would FDA like to see, this is very helpful information on both sides because FDA gets a first look in this device and can be involved throughout the product lifecycle. And there's really no particular example where it would not be advised to include a Q-Sub or to use a Q-Sub. It's generally advised just to encourage that early communication and knowledge sharing. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
So yes, for the IDE to marketing application issues. So, initially when you're established that the PMA is the right pathway, and then also understand that the clinical study has to be developed, there's different factors to consider in terms of the PMA or marketing product expectation, like when it is being submitted for PMA. So, factors to consider are making sure your requested sample size accounts for the worst case attrition, because there's no certainty that there might be continued follow-up of the patients that were initially reported in the IDE down to, providing that data actually when the PMA submission is submitted. And then auditing sites frequently to minimize deviations or missed data. And then considering consenting patients for long-term follow-up and potentially including that as a post-approval option. And of course, if there's any future concerns in the IDE, make sure to address them early. So future concerns are usually found in the IDE letter after its review about things that should be flagged as a potential concern at the time of PMA review. So just keeping that in mind as you're putting together your IDE would lead to a very smooth PMA review process and making sure that you have all your data and information available at the time of PMA receipt and during the administrative and filing reviews. There's other things that can happen, which is understandably so, as product can be developed or enhanced, and there's a broad time between the IDE development from Q-Sub to IDE development to the actual PMA submission. So sometimes there could be changes to device design over time, the investigational device, changes to the supplier, changes to manufacturing, or even protocol changes. So it is important to make sure that the FDA review team are made aware of these updates early. And because the IDE only has a 30-day review timeline, it is important to make sure that the changes are communicated so those are accounted for. Should there be any, questions or concerns or additional testing that potentially or additional report requests that may be needed in that time. And the other thing that, as a prior reviewer, I have seen is sometimes there's the use of various versions of the investigational device. So making sure you have good traceability in terms of, okay, this report was tested on this version of the investigational device, and this report was tested on this version, and rationale supporting, the equivalency could help expedite that review. Though it's not advised that that's the approach to take, but in the event that it happens, those are things to consider.
Another quick question from the audience. With many changes during the IDE, what are the reporting implications if there is an adverse event during a clinical study?
So it's important to identify, which version of the device was related to that adverse event. And then which version of the device is actually the version that will be used in the pre-market approval application or submission. That way that can help feed in or inform, the eventual safety and effectiveness decision.
Thank
I
you.
don't know if that fully answered the question, but let me know if there's any follow-up. Okay. So there's, as I think there was a question before, but yeah, pre-submission before marketing application is not required, but definitely useful if there's new or novel device designs, a significantly new testing methodology, or questions about data from the clinical trial. So this is after, the IDE has been submitted and that review has happened, and then whether or not a pre-submission is needed before the actual PMA. Generally, it's best practice to have that. So there's kind of like a timestamp of, okay, this is where we're at now. This is the questions we have, outstanding regulatory concerns. And it's a good area to include like all the regulatory history as well, leading up to that point. So either way, it's informative on both ends. And then also the other thing to consider is timing. So making sure that it is concurrent with a clinical trial that's ongoing potentially, or after, if that's still, going through the follow-up period, and then allow enough time for FDA review. So just making sure that, when you have the feedback, you're factoring in that feedback when you actually submit the PMA, and it's not, just submitting information, that there's some utility on both sides. You're asking specific questions for the PMA, and you're making sure you have enough time to factor those changes or updates or guidance into that. And more often than not, all this feedback definitely has a positive influence in terms of the swiftness of the FDA review of the PMA when it does come in-house, and also ensuring that everything, the data and all the reporting and everything is as, according to the current regulatory thinking. So those are some things to keep in mind as well. So in terms of preparing the pre-market submission, there's 3 different ways or 3 different portals or tools that you can consider or use. So e-copy, as you may all be familiar with, is a duplicate device submission in electronic format of the previously required paper copy submission sent to FDA, and it's not considered an electronic submission. And then an eStar is essentially an interactive PDF review submission template for 510(k) and de novo. And it's mandatory for both 510(k) and de novos. Though, there is the eStar version for PMAs as well. It's voluntary for original PMAs, panel track supplements, real-time, and 180-day supplement 30-day notices. And it's also optional for pre-subs, also known as pre-star, and IDE and 513G requests. But you can take a look at the links provided, which have the templates, just so you know when it does become mandatory in the future, you have familiarity in terms of how to navigate that template as you prepare your submission. And the other thing is the CDRH portal, which is a progress tracker and online submission for specific submission types. So in this link that's provided below it, it has a table that identifies what submission types it's a progress tracker for. So right now it is for de novos, 510Ks, pre-subs, and PMAs and small business designation requests. And then it also is an online portal for eStar submissions for 510Ks and SPD requests, and then also for other voluntary online submissions that can be submitted either by eCopy or eStar. But all details are outlined in that link if this information is a lot to take in. So for your actual pre-submission content, there's a table of contents, which is important, page numbers, and making sure it's divided by review area. So a specific section for administrative documents, bench testing, animal testing, clinical testing, etc. Any prior regulatory history concerning this device. So all pre-sub interactions, IDEs, and communication in history in between these submissions are very helpful also, because though the FDA review team will be familiar with it from a historical standpoint, there could be shifts in lead reviewers and whatnot. It happens, especially with the length of time from Q-sub, pre-sub before an ID to that point. So it's very helpful to have that all in one place. And then also to identify if there's any device changes that have taken place or any protocol changes. It's very, very important to highlight that as well as future considerations from IDE letters and how they were addressed and where it was addressed, copies of most recent versions of protocols, and then reviewing the RTA guidance documents for minimum content requirements. So this is an important checklist where reviewers, when they receive the PMA, they do an administrative check to make sure all content is there. So if you ensure that all of this is there against that guideline, more than likely you'll get past the RTA accept phase, and then review can continue. So do consult that guidance document for that as you're developing your submission. That just helps, move the submission along.
Jhumur, we have a couple questions from the audience. What is the general timeline for a pre-sub review? I assume this can vary quite a bit, but any guidance there I think would be helpful.
Yeah, so for pre-sub, it's usually 70 days. And then depending on whether a meeting or written feedback is requested, it's within that time frame. But of course, Susanna probably has it all memorized, but she can add in if there's anything to point in. But that's the general time frame, and it's listed in the request for feedback from FDA guidance document, or if you search Q-sub guidance on FDA online, it will lead you right to that guidance document that has a table listing that for various Q submissions.
Awesome. And just one more quick question. By using the eStar for PMA, does that eliminate the need for the RTA checklist?
That's a good question. It still undergoes the RTA review process because we are looking at the presence of all the different content overall.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much.
Hey, Jhumur, this is Susanna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Hi everyone. This is Susanna. I'm the assistant director for the team that Jhumur works in. She's giving a great presentation, but I just wanted to add to that question about the eStar. Since technically, when you're using an eStar, it no longer has an RTA. However, it does undergo a technical screening. And so while you might not get an email specifically or a notification about the RTA review, you'll get a technical screening instead. And that it still undergoes the same review to assess and make sure that all the specific components that are required for review are there and look for completeness. But you'll either get a technical screening pass or technical screening hold or something like that instead of officially getting an RTA.
Oh yes, thanks for that clarification. Yes, it's technical screening for E-stars, and then for non-E-stars, E-star submissions, it's RTA. Yes, thank you.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jhumur and Susanna, for answering those questions. There is another question that came up, Jhumur, is on can an E-star review template be used for all the pre-market applications and QSUBs?
There are 4 specific PMAs right now, and there's the pre-star for pre-subs, but right now the other types are in development. But that link that is in the previous slide is generally updated if there are any changes to the availability or capability of E-star for other submission types over time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jhumur.
Any other questions?
I think so. These are the ones
Okay.
that we have received. So we will remaining
Okay.
ones we can take up at the Q&A session.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so just running through this a little more quickly. For other considerations for submissions is to ensure that you review all relevant guidance documents and applicable standards. So there's a specific site on FDA where you can search based on topic, and it'll show or list out all relevant guidances that fall under that keyword. So do utilize that. It can come in handy and can help guide your testing strategy. The other thing is to just be upfront if there's any issues that were identified in development of the submission. So, it's understandable that it's not going to be 100% perfect, but just make sure that you're ready to provide any justifications for anything that deviates from the norm. And then also, you're going to have your lead reviewer, which is your primary point of contact during the whole submission review process. So make sure that you are keeping them in the loop should there be any updates or any additional information that they have requested that needs to be provided to them. And then, of course, if there's specific things that require their team SMEs, don't hesitate to have the lead reviewer facilitate those discussions with the consulting reviewers. And then usually with the interactive review process, it can vary based on the type of review and the type of testing, etc. And of course, all lead reviewers have different styles of review. Just make sure that you're able to provide the responses in a timely way or in a way that was requested. And you're welcome to call, email, or ask any clarification questions throughout the interactive review process. So this just provides a summary of the MDUFA performance goals and the different review days for specific submission types. And this shows that the importance of making sure that the submission is well organized and that as we're adhering to specific review timelines based on submission types. And it also identifies the importance of the Q submission process and the frequent communication process during the submission review. So during the review, just make sure that your regulatory team is ready to answer questions, have copies of the submission and any previously submitted information available should the lead reviewer have a hard time finding it. There are going to be juggling multiple submissions from various sponsors at a time. So please give that leeway as they're reaching out for questions or additional information. And also consider using the submission issue request QSUB, which is a different type of QSUB, usually asked after a deficiency letter is issued. So this is just allowing further clarification of the deficiency question should there be any confusion or ambiguity in terms of the information being requested for whatever reason. And that's also defined in the Q-Sub guidance document. What are the exceptions and considerations? The other important element is to be ready to interact on labeling. So make sure that, typically labeling is expected to be reviewed throughout the submission, but it's usually towards the end where, the clinical study and all the other testing has been evaluated, and there could be final tweaks made to the labeling interactively. So just make sure that your team is ready for a quick turnaround, and that there could be changes that are made throughout the submission process, or updates. So just be expected that there could be some specific questions on labeling, especially towards the end of the review. And the other thing is to plan for the possibility of a panel meeting. FDA will tell you as soon as they know, and many times though, the decision is driven by data in the PMA. But if there's unique scenarios, they might want to get a panel of experts to weigh in. Be also ready for inspections. So as you know, there's the pre-market side of the PMA review, but there's also the BIMO and manufacturing or GMP manufacturing side of the review. So those follow a timeline, a different timeline, but run concurrently with the pre-market. So that is also something that you need to look out for, and making sure that your firm is ready and available for inspections. And then also work with your epidemiologist and the FDA's epidemiologist on post-approval study plans early. The ideal scenario is to ensure that approve the protocol at the time of PMA approval, and not have like a conditions of approval attached to the PMA approval order and then follow up after, though it is another option available. So in the 510(k) space, when there's a deficiency letter, it's called an AINN letter, or additional information letter. For PMAs, it's called a major deficiency letter. So if there are major deficiencies that cannot be addressed during the substantive, interactive, or SI review phase within the first 90 days of the total 180 days, then it's put in the letter. And there are possible actions that you can take after receiving the letter. So there's a day 10 call where you can ask for any clarification on the deficiency letter. And the other thing is to respond to the deficiency questions as clearly as possible and within the response timeline. And then you can use the SIR Q-Sub program, or also known as Submission Issue Request Q-Sub program, to discuss the deficiency questions further. Do note that it is not a pre-review of any potential responses to the deficiency question, and it does not impact the response due date. There's also the least burdensome flag approach, where you request a review of the FDA reviewer's request for information which you believe may be overly burdensome. And I'll go into further detail in the next slide. So, the ultimate thing with the additional the letter or deficiency letter is to respond to the deficiencies, but there's other tools that you can utilize to help guide the response effectively and clarify the questions being asked. So the least burdensome flag is an opportunity to address the least burdensome discrepancies in a deficiency letter. And it's an opportunity for the submitter to address situations when they feel they are being held to a different standard. It is not an appeal meeting, and it's not a change to a 180-day response deadline. The email should include a 1 to 2 page summary where disagreements are limited to 2 topic areas, and then include all relevant prior communications and a proposed path forward. And the details are typically or are listed in the deficiency letter if you want to take that approach before responding. So there are certain common pitfalls that can happen during the PMA review, or when a letter is issued, is that there could be or in the submission itself rather, is that there could be administrative issues. So when we receive the PMA, we're doing the RTA checklist. We're using the RTA checklist to establish administrative completeness And then we do the filing to make sure the clinical data and the statistical data are aligned with, the typical study that was discussed and agreed upon, and also what we expect to see for that disease state or treatment state or treatment. So, for administrative parts, just making sure you have all the documentation in place by checking against that RTA checklist is very helpful. Making sure that you have a thorough product description, and making sure that you're referring by the same name of different components. Sometimes I know during product development, there could be various versions of the product name or component name and may not have been necessarily all aligned at the time of submission, but just looking for that and fixing that or clarifying that throughout the submission makes a huge difference, especially when you have reviewers who are dealing with multiple submissions and device types, and they're able to, follow through with, okay, this is what this particular testing is referring to, this particular device named this. So those little things make a huge difference. So, to make it easier for successful PMA, keep those in mind. And also that there's supportive data, it's present in the places that it is referenced that it would be in. There's complete responses to data requests, whether it's interactively or based on future concerns that are now being addressed in the PMA, prior Q-sub feedback, the type of general guideline that was expected, whether or not it's actually consistent with that. Just making sure that everything matches up so it tells a clean and clear story. And very important to list out all prior interactions. It makes a huge difference, and it helps significantly to review team to understand the thought process and the development, because it could be that within the span of the initial pre-sub before an IDE to the IDE and PMA, a lot of time has elapsed and a lot of things have changed. So in terms of regulatory approaches, so it's very important to capture that as well. And then poor communication. So, making sure that when there's interactions between the review or during the review, that it is clear what the testing expectations are, the information that's being requested is understood, so that way you know what you need to provide within that tight review timeline. So these are just a handful of things that can make a huge difference, and will be helpful on both sides. So for PMA, after the review, now you're done, you submitted it, it got approved, congratulations. What happens after that? So in the approval order, it lists certain requirements that the PMA holder needs to comply with, and that includes annual reports of changes that are typically not reported in a PMA supplement that needs to be sent to FDA for evaluation on an annual basis. And then it also includes reporting any supplements that were submitted for any change and how they were submitted and what's the status. Any minor labeling, manufacturing, or the other one, but there's 3 elements where it does not affect safety and effectiveness, and they're all reported in the annual report, and any references to literature. And then if there's any post-approval study requirements, that those are being met. And usually they're stated in the letter, and also sent to the mandated studies program team in-house. And then, of course, if there's any changes that happen beyond the version that was approved or the PMA product that was approved, that those are reported in specific PMA supplement types. And there's a particular guidance document that nicely lays out the different submission categories or PMA supplement categories and what changes are allowed to be or fall under those particular categories. You have, and those include 30-day notice supplements, site change supplements. And then for de novo, if you happen to have submitted a de novo, it can be used. I mean, just a reminder that this is for devices that lack a substantially equivalent predecessor and are therefore not eligible for a traditional 510(k) pathway and require a new classification and special controls to be defined. That device that is approved by de novo pathway can be used as a predicate for future 510(k) submissions. So those must continue to meet special controls. That is if, you decided that your product is not a PMA and it's de novo. And of course, for 510(k)s, if there's any modifications, those are submitted as like a special 510(k). And there's specific guidance that outlines what factors would be classified as a special 510(k). So here's our contact information. There's the Division of Consumer and Industry Education, and then the Division of Submission Support mailboxes where you can send general questions to. And then these are the folks below are members of our management team. Susanna Gilbert, who's also on the line as our Assistant Director for PMA HD Q-Sub team, and myself, who's a team lead. If you have any specific questions in those areas, feel free to email us directly or to the OPEC submission support mailbox, and we would be happy to further assist. But we hope that the information provided in this slide deck gives you a good starting point and things to consider as you're putting together your PMA submission. But with that, I would like to thank you for this opportunity and hope you found this session informative. I appreciate it. Any questions?
Thank you, Jhumur. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and practical tips with us today. I'll now open the floor for any questions. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A session box. So in between, I think there are a few more questions that I maybe we can answer by the time they are sharing the questions in the Q&A. So Jhumur, how are sponsors or submitters expected to hear from FDA with any questions they may have?
So depending on where it is in the review stage, so if it's the PMA is in-house and it's within the first 90 days during the substantive interactive review, for example, things that may be clarification questions or, can you provide the latest version of the report, or can you provide additional data points? Those can be requested by email. If there's anything that requires further discussion with SMEs, there could be a quick phone call with, setting up a meeting. In the earlier stages, when you're doing the administrative review and the filing review, because it is a shorter time frame, we expect that the sponsor, the submitter, is available to provide anything as soon as possible, given that those are things that may be readily available before proceeding with the SI review. And of course, at the SI milestone, which is the day 90, there are two options that reviewers have, which is to either proceed interactively, not often used, but the more common route is the major deficiency letter. So that is the letter that lines out all the deficiency questions that need to be addressed to complete the latter phase of the review. So that's, more formal. Proceed interactively is usually a situation where most of the content has been reviewed and it looks promising that it will be leading to approval, and there's just minor questions that remain, like clarification questions or minor labeling issues that need to be resolved. And so that's when we go through the proceed interactively route, and it's mainly email communication, phone calls, or small meetings, things like that.
Thank you, Jhumur. So there is another question on pre-sub, which can it be helpful for PMA supplement application, which involves new device, new use indication?
So pre-sub can be used for any future application. And so the distinction is there's specific questions that are asked relating to, okay, does like it varies really the types of questions, but I would say that it can be used for all future submissions.
Yeah, that's should be the case. And what is the FDA's advice in designing protocols for both performance and long-term follow-up when only the performance data is required for PMA review? And there is a follow-up question on that as well. Can it be a single protocol with clear data separation, or is it advised to structure it as two separate protocols?
I think best practice would be to structure it as two separate protocols so that if there are changes made and down the line, you're not having to include both in that singular submission. There are, specific timelines or pathways for updating post-approval protocols versus the modifying the actual existing protocol that was used to make the pre-market decision. So yeah, it's advised to keep it separate.
Thank you. I think we are right at the time, and we have done almost all the questions. I would ask Renee to convey a thank you note. Renee.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Jhumur.
Yeah, thank you so much for
Thank you.
attending. I saw some questions about the slide deck and the recording, and you should receive those within 24 hours from RAPS. So you can, you'll have those for sure, along with some other documentation. So thank you so much for joining us today. RAPS, I'm not sure if you guys have anything else to say, but thank you. We appreciate it.